Some people believe mountains remember every soul they bury beneath the snow. On the night the blizzard came for Black Hollow Ridge, Elias Grayson almost became one of them. The storm rolled across northern Montana like a living wall, swallowing pine trees, cabins, and frozen roads beneath swirling curtains of white. Wind hammered the mountainside hard enough to shake windows loose from their frames, and the world beyond Elias's cabin vanished into a blur of ice and darkness. Inside, the old stone fireplace crackled softly, throwing amber light across the rough wooden walls. Elias sat alone at the small kitchen table with a steaming cup of black coffee cooling untouched beside him. At 40 years old, the former Army combat engineer had learned how silence could become heavier than noise. His broad shoulders still carried the shape of military discipline, but time and grief had worn the sharpness from him. Faint silver threaded through his dark brown hair, and the lines around his storm-gray eyes deepened every winter he spent alone in the mountains. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees like something searching for a way inside. Elias glanced toward the frost-covered window as another gust rattled the cabin. The storm was getting worse. Weather reports had warned of nearly 4 feet of snowfall overnight, enough to bury entire trails beneath drifts taller than a man. Most people in Black Hollow stayed far from the ridge during storms like this. But Elias had never been most people. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, letting the heat soak into his calloused fingers. Somewhere beneath the howl of the wind, the mountain groaned softly, a deep sound like ancient wood shifting in its sleep. Then came the cry. Elias froze. At first he thought it was only the storm twisting through the canyon walls. But 27 seconds later, it came again. A small, desperate sound. A puppy crying somewhere beyond the cabin. He slowly lifted his head. The fire popped behind him. The cry returned once more, thin and trembling beneath the roar of the blizzard. Not imagination. Not wind. Something alive was out there. Elias stood immediately, every instinct sharpening. At once. He crossed to the window and wiped the frost aside with the sleeve of his flannel jacket. Nothing but white darkness stared back at him. Snow whipped sideways through the trees under the pale beam of the porch light. Another cry drifted through the storm. Closer this time. He muttered under his breath. "You've gotta be kidding me." Most men would have stayed inside. The mountain had already taken enough lives over the years. Hikers lost beneath avalanches. Rangers swallowed by sudden storms. An entire rescue crew had disappeared on the northern slope nearly 50 years ago. Black Hollow Ridge carried stories people only whispered about in diners and gas stations. But something in that cry reached a place inside Elias he thought had frozen long ago. He grabbed his heavy canvas coat from the wall hook and shoved his arms into it. Thick gloves. Flashlight. Rope. Old habits returned with mechanical precision. Before opening the door, he paused beside the faded photograph sitting near the fireplace mantel. 2 young soldiers smiled back at him beneath a desert sun. Elias and his younger brother Caleb. One came home from the war. One never did. The storm outside screamed against the cabin walls. Then the cry came again. 27 seconds exactly. Elias opened the door, and the mountain swallowed him whole. The cold struck Elias instantly, sharp enough to steal the breath from his lungs the moment he stepped off the porch. Snow whipped across Black Hollow Ridge in violent spirals, stinging his face and coating his beard with frost within seconds. The porch light behind him faded quickly beneath the storm until the cabin became nothing more than a faint amber blur swallowed by white darkness. He pulled the collar of his canvas coat higher and listened carefully. The mountain had a way of playing tricks during blizzards. Wind could sound like voices. Cracking ice could resemble footsteps. More than one traveler had wandered into the snow chasing sounds that never existed. But 27 seconds later, the cry returned. Thin. Weak. Alive. Elias turned toward the northern slope immediately. The beam from his flashlight cut through curtains of snow, illuminating only fragments of pine trunks and drifting ice crystals that looked like ash floating through the night air. His boots sank nearly knee-deep as he pushed forward through the storm. The wind roared between the cliffs with a low hollow tone that reminded him of distant artillery rolling across desert valleys years ago. He hated that memory. Some nights it still followed him into his dreams. Another cry echoed ahead. Closer now. Elias moved faster, forcing his way through the drifts while frozen branches scraped against his sleeves. The forest around him seemed strangely still beneath the screaming wind, as though the mountain itself were listening. Then his flashlight caught movement near a fallen cedar tree half buried beneath the snow. Elias stopped immediately. At first he saw only a dark shape trapped between broken ice and twisted roots. Then the shape lifted its head. A tiny German shepherd puppy stared back at him with frightened amber eyes. Snow clung to its black and tan fur in frozen clumps, and one small paw remained pinned beneath a slab of cracked ice near the base of the tree. The puppy cried again, softer this time, barely audible beneath the storm. Elias exhaled slowly. "Easy there, little guy." He crouched carefully beside the tree, brushing snow aside with his gloved hands. The puppy trembled violently but did not try to bite or pull away. Instead, it kept glancing toward the darkness farther up the ridge as if something beyond the storm still held its attention. Elias worked the ice loose piece by piece until finally the trapped paw slipped free. The puppy stumbled forward instantly and pressed itself against his coat, shivering hard enough that Elias could feel it through the thick canvas layers. He wrapped one arm around the small dog and checked the injured paw beneath the flashlight beam. Slight swelling. No break that he could see. "Lucky. You are tougher than you look," he murmured quietly. The puppy looked up at him for the first time, ears twitching weakly beneath the snow. For a brief moment, something inside Elias softened. He had spent too many winters alone on this mountain, speaking more to silence than people. The storm suddenly groaned through the ridge again, deeper this time. A low vibration rolled beneath the snowpack under Elias's boots. The puppy stiffened instantly. Then it turned sharply toward the cliffside above them and released 3 short barks into the darkness. Elias followed its gaze. At first he saw nothing except blowing snow. Then somewhere high above the trees, a faint blue light flickered beneath the ice for half a second before disappearing completely. Elias frowned slowly. The puppy continued staring toward the ridge, ears raised now despite the cold, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice. The journey back to the cabin felt longer somehow, as if the storm itself had thickened around them after the strange blue light vanished beneath the ridge. Snow continued pouring from the sky in endless sheets, softening the outlines of the forest until the world looked painted in shades of gray and white. Elias held the puppy tightly beneath his coat while pushing through waist-high drifts toward the faint glow of home. The small dog trembled against his chest at first, but little by little its breathing steadied. Every few moments, though, its ears twitched toward the mountain behind them. Listening. Waiting. The wind carried a strange sound across the ridge then, low and hollow beneath the storm. Not thunder. Not shifting trees. Something deeper. Elias felt it more than heard it. A vibration beneath the snowpack that traveled through the soles of his boots and disappeared again before he could fully understand it. The puppy suddenly lifted its head and gave a quiet whine. "Yeah," Elias muttered softly. "I felt it too." By the time the cabin finally appeared through the white darkness, ice clung to Elias's beard and shoulders like frozen ash. The porch light glowed weakly through the storm, warm and lonely against the endless cold surrounding Black Hollow Ridge. He pushed open the door and stepped inside as the wind slammed hard against the walls behind him. Heat from the fireplace rolled through the room immediately, carrying the scent of cedar smoke and old pine. Elias knelt beside the hearth and wrapped the puppy carefully in a wool blanket. Near the fire, the little German shepherd blinked slowly in the warmth, exhausted but alert. Its fur had a beautiful mix of black saddle markings and pale golden cream around the chest and paws, though patches of ice still clung stubbornly along its sides. Elias poured warm water into a metal bowl and placed it nearby. The puppy drank cautiously, never fully taking its eyes off him. "You need a name," Elias said quietly after a while. The puppy tilted its head slightly. Outside, wind rattled the cabin windows again. Elias stared into the fire for several silent seconds before speaking once more. "Rusty," he murmured. "You look like a Rusty." The puppy's tail tapped softly against the floorboards once. Elias almost smiled. It had been a long time since anything living answered the silence in this cabin. He added another log to the fireplace while snow hissed softly against the roof overhead. The storm continued building outside, but something inside the cabin had shifted. The empty rooms no longer felt quite so hollow. Rusty curled closer to the fire for a moment before suddenly lifting his head again. His ears stood tall. The puppy stared toward the back wall of the cabin where old stone disappeared into shadow beside the storage shelves. Elias noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" Rusty rose slowly onto shaky paws and limped toward the wall. He sniffed the floorboards once, then pressed one paw against the cold stone foundation beneath the window. A low sound escaped his throat. Not fear. Recognition. Elias frowned and stepped closer. At first he heard nothing except the crackling fire behind him. Then it came again. A faint vibration beneath the floor. Rhythmic. Slow. The lantern hanging near the kitchen swayed almost invisibly. Elias crouched beside the wall and placed his hand flat against the stone. Cold. Rough. Solid. Then 27 seconds later, the vibration returned. Stronger this time. Rusty gave 3 short barks and backed away from the wall. The fire flickered suddenly as though something deep beneath the mountain had exhaled. Elias looked toward the frozen window, heart beating slower and heavier now. Somewhere beyond the storm, beneath thousands of tons of ice and rock, Black Hollow Ridge was awake. Morning arrived slowly over Black Hollow Ridge, pale and ghost-like beneath layers of storm clouds that still smothered the mountain peaks. The blizzard had weakened during the night, but snow continued drifting softly across the frozen landscape outside Elias's cabin. The world beyond the windows looked untouched, buried beneath smooth blankets of white that reflected the dull silver light of dawn. Inside, the fire had burned low to glowing embers. Elias sat quietly at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee warming his hands while Rusty slept beside the hearth wrapped in the old wool blanket. For a few peaceful minutes, the cabin almost felt normal. Then the vibration returned. The coffee inside Elias's mug rippled slightly. Once. Soft and steady beneath the floorboards. 27 seconds later, it came again. Rusty's head lifted instantly. The puppy stood, ears raised sharply toward the back wall of the cabin where the stone foundation disappeared into shadow. Elias slowly set down the mug. The same rhythm. Exact. Mechanical almost. But mountains were not supposed to breathe like living things. A sudden sound outside broke the silence. Tires crunching through deep snow. Elias glanced toward the window and saw an old green Forest Service truck climbing the narrow trail toward the cabin. Snow sprayed behind its tires before the vehicle finally stopped near the porch. A woman stepped out into the cold morning wind, pulling her heavy coat tighter around herself as she studied the cabin carefully. Elias recognized her immediately. Clara Bellamy. She had been a ranger on Black Hollow Ridge for nearly 10 years, longer than anyone else stayed up here willingly. Most people eventually left the mountain behind. Clara never did. Elias opened the door before she reached the porch. "You picked one hell of a morning for a drive," he said quietly. Clara brushed snow from her dark brown hair and glanced toward the ridge behind the cabin before answering. "Radio tower picked up strange seismic readings around midnight," she replied. Thought I should check on the only stubborn man still living this high. Up the mountain. Her sharp green eyes shifted downward, then stopped on Rusty standing inside beside the fireplace. The puppy watched her carefully without barking. Clara frowned slightly. Where did the dog come from? Elias hesitated for a second. Found him trapped near the North Ridge last night. Clara's expression changed almost immediately. Not fear exactly. Something quieter. Older. She stepped inside slowly while the cabin walls creaked softly against the cold outside. North Ridge, she repeated under her breath. Rusty limped closer to her and sniffed cautiously at her boots. Then he turned toward the back wall again and released a soft whine. Clara noticed. He keeps doing that. Elias nodded once. Every time those vibrations happen. Right on cue, the floor trembled gently beneath them again. Clara went completely still. 27 seconds later, another pulse rolled through the cabin. The lantern hanging above the kitchen swayed faintly. Outside, wind whispered through the pines like distant voices drifting beneath the snow. Clara stared toward the stone wall for a long moment before speaking quietly. 48 years ago, a rescue team disappeared on this mountain during a blizzard almost identical to this one. Elias said nothing. He had heard pieces of the story before, mostly from old men drinking coffee in town. But people spoke about Black Hollow carefully, as if the mountain itself might overhear them. Clara continued softly. 6 men. 1 search dog. They were responding to emergency signals coming from the North Ridge after an avalanche buried part of the old mining tunnels. Rusty's ears twitched immediately at the words old mining tunnels. Clara noticed that too. Her voice lowered further. The strange part is they kept transmitting radio signals for nearly 3 days after the storm passed. Voices. Morse code. Static. But nobody ever found them. Another vibration rolled beneath the cabin floor. Rusty suddenly barked 3 sharp times toward the frozen ridge outside the window. And far beyond the trees, somewhere deep beneath the snow-covered mountain, a faint blue light flickered once beneath the ice. Snow continued falling through the afternoon in slow silver sheets that drifted across Black Hollow Ridge like ash from some ancient fire buried beneath the mountain. The storm no longer screamed the way it had during the night, but the silence that replaced it felt somehow stranger. Heavy. Listening. Elias stood on the cabin porch beside Clara Bellamy while Rusty paced nervously through the fresh snow near the tree line. The puppy kept stopping every few seconds to stare toward the northern ridge where the blue light had flickered beneath the ice. You ever actually see those radio signals yourself? Elias asked quietly. Clara nodded once without taking her eyes off the mountain. Twice. Her breath drifted into the cold air like smoke. The first winter I worked up here, I heard Morse code coming through an emergency channel that has been dead since the 1970s. Elias glanced at her. What did it say? Clara hesitated for a moment. Still here. Wind whispered softly through the frozen pines surrounding the cabin. Somewhere deeper in the forest, ice cracked beneath the weight of snow with a sound like distant thunder rolling beneath the earth. Rusty suddenly stiffened near the edge of the clearing. His ears rose sharply. Then he began digging. Fast. Snow sprayed behind his small paws as he clawed furiously at a spot beside an old cedar stump almost completely buried beneath the drifts. Elias stepped off the porch immediately. Rusty. The puppy ignored him completely and kept digging harder, whining low in his throat between frantic breaths. Clara followed beside Elias through knee-deep snow while the mountain groaned softly beneath them again. 1 pulse. Then another 27 seconds later. Rusty barked 3 times and backed away from the hole he had uncovered. Beneath the snow lay a flat section of dark stone barely visible through layers of ice. Elias crouched and brushed away more snow with his gloves. Faint markings slowly emerged beneath the frost. Not natural cracks. Letters. Clara knelt beside him silently. The carving was old and weathered, nearly smooth by decades of storms, but the symbol at the center remained visible enough to recognize. A rescue cross. Forest Service issue from nearly 50 years ago. Elias frowned. This should not be up here. Clara looked pale suddenly. The missing rescue team carried markers like that. Elias brushed more ice aside carefully until additional markings appeared beneath the cross. 3 carved letters. SOS. Rusty stepped closer and pressed his nose against the frozen stone while snow drifted quietly around all 3 of them. The puppy gave a soft whine and looked uphill again toward the northern ridge. Elias followed his gaze slowly. A narrow rise of snow-covered earth climbed between 2 cliffs farther up the mountain, hidden behind thick walls of pine and ice. From below it looked almost natural. But now Elias noticed something strange about the slope. The snow there had partially collapsed inward. Like weight pressing beneath it from below. Clara saw it too. That was not there yesterday, she whispered. Another vibration rolled beneath their boots. Stronger now. Snow slipped from nearby branches in soft avalanches while somewhere deep under the mountain a faint metallic sound echoed upward through the earth. Rusty's ears twitched immediately. Then the puppy turned and started limping uphill toward the hidden slope without hesitation. Elias stood quickly. Where are you going? Rusty stopped once and looked back at him. Waiting. Wind drifted through the trees carrying the cold scent of pine and frozen stone. The mountain seemed quieter now, almost expectant beneath the gray sky. Clara stared toward the hidden rise with visible tension in her face. Elias, she said softly. If there really are tunnels beneath this ridge, she never finished the sentence. Because at that exact moment, somewhere beyond the cliffs above them, a dim blue light flickered beneath the snow once again. The climb toward the hidden ridge grew steeper with every step. Snow crunched beneath Elias's boots while cold wind drifted between the cliffs in long mournful breaths that sounded almost human beneath the fading storm. Rusty moved ahead carefully despite his injured paw, stopping every few yards to glance back as if making certain Elias and Clara were still following. The puppy no longer looked frightened. Focused was the only word Elias could think of. Like the mountain was pulling the small dog toward something it already understood. Gray clouds pressed low over Black Hollow Ridge, dimming the afternoon light until the world around them looked trapped between daylight and dusk. Pine branches sagged heavily beneath fresh snow, and now and then a soft cascade of powder slid quietly to the ground around them. The deeper they climbed, the stranger the mountain felt. Too still. No birds. No movement except the wind whispering through frozen stone. Then the vibration came again. Strong enough this time that loose snow slipped from the rocks beside the trail. Elias stopped immediately. Beneath his boots, the ground pulsed once with a deep mechanical thrum that did not belong beneath any mountain. 27 seconds later, another pulse answered from somewhere farther below. Clara looked uneasy now. You feel how regular it is? She asked softly. Elias nodded. Not natural. Rusty suddenly barked 3 sharp times and scrambled ahead toward a narrow gap between 2 cliffs nearly hidden beneath snowdrifts. Elias pushed through after him and froze the moment the passage opened into a small clearing beyond. The earth here had partially collapsed inward, exposing dark metal beneath layers of snow and ice. Clara inhaled sharply beside him. A staircase. Steel steps descended into the mountain at a steep angle before disappearing into darkness below. Half the entrance remained buried, but enough had broken free for the outline to become visible now. Rusted support beams framed the opening, and faded yellow paint still clung to sections of the metal walls beneath decades of frost. Elias brushed snow away from one beam with his glove. Faint lettering emerged slowly beneath the ice. Emergency Shelter Access 7. The words hit him harder than he expected. He remembered military shelters like this from his engineering days overseas. Reinforced underground structures built to survive avalanches, storms, even earthquakes. But nobody had ever mentioned a shelter buried beneath Black Hollow Ridge. Clara stared at the staircase with pale disbelief. This was never on any Forest Service maps. Wind drifted through the cliffs above them carrying soft grains of snow that shimmered briefly in the gray light. Rusty moved to the edge of the opening and stared downward into the darkness beneath the mountain. His ears twitched once. Then the puppy released a low whine. Elias stepped closer carefully and aimed his flashlight below. The beam vanished deep into the staircase, revealing metal railings coated with frost and walls lined with old electrical conduit. Far beneath them, almost too distant to see clearly, something flickered blue for half a second. Clara swallowed hard. That is the same light. Elias said nothing. His pulse had slowed into the cold focused rhythm he remembered from years in uniform. Part of him wanted to turn back immediately. Mountains buried things for reasons. But another part of him could not ignore what stood in front of them now. Especially not after hearing those vibrations beneath the cabin all night. Rusty took one cautious step onto the staircase. Then another. The puppy stopped suddenly and looked back toward Elias once more. Waiting again. Snow drifted silently through the clearing while the mountain groaned somewhere deep below their feet. Elias tightened his grip on the flashlight. "All right," he said quietly into the frozen air. "Let us see what this mountain has been hiding." And somewhere far beneath the steel staircase, a faint metallic sound echoed upward through the darkness like an old door slowly opening after many years. The air inside the staircase felt different from the world above. Warmer somehow. Not warm enough to melt the frost coating the steel railings, but enough that Elias noticed it immediately as they descended deeper beneath Black Hollow Ridge. Their footsteps echoed softly through the tunnel while snow drifted down from the entrance far above them like pale ash falling through forgotten ruins. Rusty moved carefully ahead despite his injured paw, his nose twitching constantly as if following a scent buried deep beneath layers of stone and time. Clara stayed close behind Elias, one hand resting near the flashlight clipped to her coat. The beam from Elias's light swept slowly across the walls as they descended. Thick concrete reinforced with steel mesh. Old emergency wiring. Rusted pipes running overhead beside faded warning signs almost erased by decades underground. The deeper they went, the more impossible the place felt. This was not a simple mining tunnel. Someone had built this shelter to survive something serious. Another vibration rolled beneath the staircase. The metal steps hummed softly under Elias's boots. 27 seconds later, the pulse came again. Rusty stopped instantly and looked downward into the darkness below. Elias noticed something then that made his skin tighten beneath the cold. The puppy was no longer trembling. It was almost as if the deeper they traveled underground, the calmer Rusty became. The staircase finally opened into a long concrete corridor stretching beneath the mountain. Elias stepped carefully onto the tunnel floor while the sound of distant wind disappeared behind them. Silence settled around the corridor in a way that felt heavy rather than peaceful. The walls here remained strangely intact despite the decades. Emergency lights lined the ceiling every 20 feet, most shattered or dead, though one near the far end flickered faint blue every few moments. The same light they had seen through the ice above. Clara whispered softly beside him. This place should not still have power. Elias nodded slowly. Unless something down here never stopped running. Rusty moved ahead through the corridor with sudden purpose now. His claws clicked softly against the concrete floor while his ears stayed fixed toward the darkness ahead. Elias followed carefully, flashlight sweeping across old supply crates stacked against the walls. Most had collapsed with age, spilling moldy blankets and rusted emergency gear across the floor. Then the beam landed on something else. Footprints. Elias crouched immediately. Thin layers of dust coated most of the corridor floor, untouched for years. But crossing through the dust near the far wall were fresh tracks. Human footprints. Clara stared in disbelief. That is impossible. Elias studied the prints carefully. Boot marks. Recent. No more than a day old. The same direction they were heading now. Rusty released a low growl beneath his breath. Somewhere farther down the tunnel, metal creaked softly. Elias rose slowly and tightened his grip on the flashlight. The corridor opened into a larger chamber ahead. Rows of rusted bunk beds lined the walls beneath faded emergency maps of Black Hollow Ridge. A long communications desk sat near the center of the room, covered in old radio equipment and frozen coffee mugs left exactly where someone had once abandoned them. The room looked less like ruins and more like time had simply stopped. Clara moved slowly past one of the bunks and brushed dust from a military blanket folded neatly at the corner. "My God," she whispered. "It is like they expected to come back." Rusty suddenly barked once toward the far wall. Elias turned his flashlight immediately. Mounted beside a heavy steel door at the back of the chamber hung a row of faded photographs beneath cracked glass. Search and rescue teams. Winter cruise. Rangers standing shoulder to shoulder in old snow gear beneath the mountain sun. Elias stepped closer slowly. Then his heartbeat stopped cold inside his chest. One of the photographs showed 6 men standing beside a rescue helicopter during the winter of 1978. And there, second from the left beneath layers of dust and fading age, stood a young man with storm-gray eyes and dark hair almost identical to Elias's own. Caleb Grayson smiled back at him from beneath the mountain. Elias could not move for several seconds. The flashlight trembled faintly in his hand while he stared at the photograph beneath the cracked glass. Caleb looked young in the picture, maybe 22 at most, wearing a thick rescue jacket with snow dusted across the shoulders and the same quiet half-smile he always carried whenever he thought nobody was watching him. Elias remembered that smile from long before the war. Long before funerals and folded flags and empty years spent trying not to remember things that hurt too much. Clara stepped closer beside him. "Elias," he barely heard her. His eyes stayed locked on the faded image while old memories rose slowly through him like something thawing. Beneath ice. Caleb had died in Afghanistan nearly 18 years ago. At least that was what the army told them. Vehicle collapsed during a mountain operation. No body recovered. Elias remembered standing beside his mother at the funeral while rain tapped softly against the church windows. He remembered staring at an empty casket and thinking how strange it felt to bury silence instead of a person. Rusty pressed gently against Elias's leg, grounding him back into the cold underground chamber. The puppy stared up at the photograph too, ears twitching softly. Elias finally forced himself to breathe again. "This cannot be him," Clara whispered carefully. The rescue team disappeared in 1978. Elias swallowed hard. Caleb was born years after that. Another vibration rolled beneath the floor. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams while the blue emergency light flickered weakly overhead. 27 seconds later, the pulse came again. More powerful this time. Rusty suddenly barked sharply toward the heavy steel door at the far end of the chamber. Elias turned immediately. The door stood partially open now. Just an inch. He could have sworn it had been fully sealed moments earlier. Clara noticed it too. "Did you touch that?" Elias shook his head slowly. Cold air drifted through the narrow opening carrying the faint scent of metal and something else beneath it. Warm earth. Impossible warmth for a place buried beneath snow and ice. Rusty moved toward the door without hesitation. The puppy squeezed through the narrow gap and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Rusty. Elias crossed the chamber quickly and pulled the heavy door open farther with both hands. Rusted hinges groaned softly through the tunnel. Beyond the doorway stretched another corridor, narrower than the first and lined with old pipes humming faintly beneath the walls. Steam curled softly from one cracked vent overhead. Clara stared in disbelief. "There is heat down here." The corridor sloped deeper beneath the mountain. Rusty waited farther ahead beneath another flickering blue light, his tail low but steady. Elias noticed something strange along the floor then. More footprints. Fresh. Again. Not just one set this time. Several. Some large. Some smaller. All leading deeper underground. The walls around them vibrated softly once more, and somewhere in the distance a faint sound echoed through the tunnels. Static. Elias froze immediately. Through the silence beneath the mountain came the unmistakable crackle of an old radio struggling against interference. Clara heard it too. No, she whispered under her breath. The sound faded briefly. Then a voice emerged through the static. Weak. Distorted. Almost impossible to understand. Elias stepped farther into the corridor, heart pounding slowly now beneath the heavy silence. The voice returned again through the distant speakers hidden somewhere below them. Shelter 7, static swallowed the words for a moment. If anyone hears this, stay away from the lower chambers. Rusty released a low uneasy whine. The radio crackled louder suddenly. Then another voice cut through the interference. Softer this time. Familiar enough to stop Elias cold where he stood. Elias, his blood turned to ice. Because beneath the mountain, through decades of silence and static, he would have known that voice anywhere. The sound of the radio drifted through the underground corridor like a ghost carried on old electricity. Static crackled softly between broken fragments of words while steam hissed from the pipes overhead in slow uneven breaths. Elias stood frozen beneath the flickering blue light, unable to move even as every rational thought inside him insisted the voice could not be real. Caleb had been gone for 18 years. He had repeated that truth to himself through funerals, sleepless nights, and every lonely winter spent hiding from memories inside the mountains. Yet somewhere ahead in the darkness beneath Black Hollow Ridge, his brother's voice had just spoken his name. Rusty pressed close against Elias's leg, ears pinned back now as the puppy stared deeper into the tunnel. Clara looked pale beside him. Tell me that was not what I think it was. Elias swallowed hard but said nothing. The radio crackled again. Power levels holding, static swallowed the sentence. Do not enter the lower sectors, then. Silence returned. The tunnel felt colder suddenly despite the warmth drifting through the vents. Elias forced himself forward. The corridor narrowed as they descended deeper beneath the mountain, twisting through reinforced concrete walls stained by decades of moisture and rust. Pipes hummed steadily somewhere behind the walls now, feeding heat into the underground shelter from some hidden source still operating far below. Rusty limped ahead cautiously, pausing every few moments to sniff the air. The puppy no longer seemed afraid exactly. Uneasy was closer to the truth. Like he sensed something old waking beneath the mountain around them. The corridor finally opened into another chamber larger than the last. Elias swept his flashlight slowly across the room and stopped breathing for a second time that day. The underground operations center remained almost perfectly preserved. Long metal desks stood covered with maps, emergency reports, and dusty radio equipment. A wall clock above the far door had frozen at exactly 2:17. Coffee cups still rested beside half-open notebooks. Thick winter coats hung neatly beside lockers as though the rescue crews had only stepped away for a moment and never returned. Clara moved carefully through the room in stunned silence. This place has been sealed for nearly 50 years. Elias brushed dust from one of the desks. Beneath his hand lay an old Forest Service logbook. The final entry had been written in shaky handwriting. Tunnel instability increasing. Strange heat source discovered below Sector 4. Radio interference worsening. Then nothing after that. Rusty suddenly barked once toward the back corner of the operations room. Elias turned immediately. A small emergency radio sat there beneath layers of dust. Unlike the others, this one still glowed faintly blue. Static whispered softly through the speaker. Elias crossed the room slowly and reached for the dial. The moment his fingers touched the radio, the speaker crackled violently. Then the voice returned. Clearer this time. If you are hearing this, the mountain finally chose someone. Elias felt every muscle in his body tighten. Caleb. It sounded exactly like Caleb. Older. Somehow. Tired. But unmistakable. Clara stared at him in disbelief. How is that possible? The radio hissed again before continuing. The shelter is alive. Do not trust the lower generators. They were never meant to run this long. Static surged through the speaker. Then another sound emerged beneath the interference. A rhythmic mechanical pulse. The same vibration that had echoed beneath the cabin all night. 27 seconds apart. Rusty backed away from the radio and released a nervous whine. Elias noticed something then near the operations table beside the wall. A photograph lay partially hidden beneath an old map. He picked it up slowly. The image showed the missing rescue team standing outside this very shelter many years ago. But one detail made his blood run cold. Standing beside the 6 rescuers was a young German Shepherd puppy with black and golden fur almost identical to Rusty's. Around the puppy's neck hung a small brass tag. Elias turned the photograph toward the flashlight beam and read the faded engraving beneath the dust. Rusty. The operations room fell silent except for the soft hiss of the radio and the deep mechanical pulse echoing beneath the mountain every 27 seconds. Elias stared at the faded photograph in his trembling hand while questions crowded his mind faster than he could control them. The puppy beside the rescue crew looked exactly like Rusty. Same sharp ears. Same pale gold markings around the eyes. Even the small white patch near the chest matched perfectly. But the photograph had been taken nearly 50 years ago. Rusty could not possibly exist in both places separated by decades of time. Clara stepped closer slowly, her flashlight beam resting on the brass tag around the dog's neck in the picture. Maybe they reused the name, she whispered, though even she sounded unconvinced. Rusty stood beside Elias staring quietly at the photograph, his amber eyes reflecting the pale blue emergency light overhead. Then the puppy suddenly turned toward the far end of the room and released a low uneasy growl. Elias followed his gaze immediately. Beyond the operations center, another steel corridor stretched deeper underground. Unlike the others, this passage looked newer somehow. The walls carried less rust. Dim blue lighting still glowed steadily along the ceiling, powered by whatever hidden system continued breathing beneath Black Hollow Ridge after all these years. Warm air drifted steadily from the darkness ahead. Elias folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. We keep moving, he said quietly. Clara hesitated only a second before nodding. They followed Rusty deeper beneath the mountain while the old radio behind them crackled softly with fading static. The corridor sloped downward at a sharper angle now. Pipes vibrated behind the walls carrying warm water or steam from somewhere below. Elias could feel heat rising through the floor beneath his boots with each step. The mechanical pulse grew stronger too. Not random vibrations anymore. Rhythmic. Almost like the steady heartbeat of some enormous machine hidden beneath the earth. 27 seconds. Pulse. 27 more. Pulse again. Rusty moved faster now despite his limp, drawn toward the lower levels with growing urgency. The puppy paused suddenly near a heavy security door standing partially open along the corridor wall. A faded sign overhead read Generator Sector 4. Clara stopped immediately. That was in the radio message. Elias pushed the steel door open carefully. Warm air rolled out instantly carrying the scent of oil, old metal, and damp stone. The chamber beyond was enormous. Massive industrial generators lined both walls stretching deep into the mountain, their surfaces humming softly beneath layers of dust and condensation. Thick pipes disappeared into the rock ceiling overhead while spinning gauges and blinking lights continued operating as though the system had never shut down. Clara stared in disbelief. These generators are still running. Elias walked slowly between the towering machines, studying the equipment with the trained eyes of a former engineer. None of it made sense. Systems this old should have failed decades ago without maintenance. Yet everything here remained active. Stable. Alive. Another pulse rolled through the chamber, stronger now beneath their feet. Rusty barked sharply toward the far side of the room where a narrow staircase descended even deeper underground. The puppy sprinted toward it before stopping beside a cracked glass observation window built into the wall. Elias reached the window and froze. Beyond the glass stretched a vast underground cavern hidden beneath the mountain. Steam drifted through the enormous chamber while rivers of glowing blue water flowed beneath steel catwalks disappearing into the darkness. At the center of the cavern stood a massive geothermal reactor surrounded by old emergency lights still burning faintly after all these years. The machine pulsed with slow steady energy every 27 seconds, feeding warmth through the shelter above like blood through veins. Clara whispered in awe. This mountain has been running its own power station the entire time. Then the radio mounted beside the observation window crackled violently to life. Static filled the chamber before the familiar voice returned once more. Calm. Tired. Human. Elias, if you found the reactor, then it means the storm has come back. The voice faded into static once more, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the mountain above them. Elias stood motionless beside the observation window staring into the glowing cavern below while steam drifted slowly through the underground chamber like breath rising from the earth itself. The geothermal reactor pulsed steadily in the darkness beneath them, sending soft waves of blue light across the steel walls every 27 seconds. Pulse. Silence. Pulse again. Rusty sat beside Elias now, unusually calm, his amber eyes fixed on the glowing machine far below. Clara crossed slowly toward the radio mounted near the glass and brushed dust from its cracked surface. This transmission is impossible, she whispered. No system should still be functioning after all this time. Elias barely heard her. His attention remained trapped somewhere between the voice on the radio and the memories clawing their way back into his chest. Caleb had always loved mountains. Even as a kid he used to disappear into the woods behind their parents' farm for hours with nothing but a flashlight. And a backpack full of junk food. Their mother used to joke that Caleb trusted wilderness more than people. Elias remembered laughing at that once. Back before war turned laughter into something rare. Rusty suddenly stood and trotted toward a narrow maintenance staircase descending beside the observation deck. The puppy barked softly once, then looked back toward Elias. Waiting again. Elias exhaled slowly. He wants us to go lower. Clara looked uneasy. The voice specifically warned us about the lower sectors. Another pulse rolled through the floor beneath them. This one stronger than before. Somewhere deep inside the reactor chamber, metal groaned softly beneath the mountain. Elias stared through the observation glass once more. The geothermal system was old but stable for now. But he recognized the signs of strain in the pipes and pressure gauges below. If the system failed during another blizzard, the entire underground shelter would freeze solid within hours. He tightened his jaw slightly. If somebody built this place to save lives, we cannot leave it buried down here forever. Clara studied him for a moment before nodding once. Together they followed Rusty down the narrow staircase into the lower levels beneath Black Hollow Ridge. Heat rose stronger the deeper they descended. Moisture coated the walls here, and soft rivers of warm condensation ran along channels carved into the concrete floor. The air smelled of iron, minerals, and ancient stone hidden from sunlight for generations. At the bottom of the staircase they entered another chamber smaller than the others but strangely personal. Bookshelves lined one wall beside a narrow cot and a wooden desk cluttered with old journals, radio schematics, and faded maps. Unlike the abandoned rooms above, this place looked lived in. Maintained. A lantern near the desk still glowed faintly blue beside stacks of neatly folded blankets. Clara stared around the room in disbelief. Someone stayed here. Elias moved slowly toward the desk. Dust covered most surfaces, but recent footprints crossed the floor toward the far wall where another radio transmitter hummed quietly beneath blinking lights. Rusty approached the cot and placed both paws gently against the edge of the blanket. Then he looked toward Elias with soft, steady eyes. Elias noticed something resting atop the pillow. A small silver compass. He picked it up carefully, and his breath caught immediately. The back carried an engraving worn smooth with age. To Caleb. Keep finding your way home. Dad. Elias closed his eyes for a second as old grief moved silently through him like winter wine through dead trees. Their father had given Caleb that compass before his first deployment overseas. Elias remembered because he had been there on the porch watching it happen beneath a summer sunset many lifetimes ago. Rusty whimpered softly beside him. Then the radio crackled once more. This time the voice sounded clearer than ever before. Older. Weary. But unmistakably human. Elias, if you are hearing this, then the mountain finally opened the way. The radio hissed softly after the voice faded, filling the small underground room with static that sounded almost like distant snowfall drifting across frozen trees. Elias stood motionless beside the desk, Caleb's old compass resting heavily in his hand while the warmth of the underground shelter pulsed around them every 27 seconds. Rusty sat quietly near the cot now, watching Elias with calm amber eyes that no longer carried fear. The puppy looked almost at peace beneath the mountain. Clara slowly opened one of the weathered journals scattered across the desk. Most of the pages were filled with engineering notes, temperature readings, and maintenance schedules written in careful handwriting. But near the middle of the journal, the entries changed. The handwriting became uneven. Personal. Clara read softly beneath the blue glow of the lantern. Storm worsening above ground. Reactor stable for now. Shelter continues providing heat through the ridge. If the outside world ever finds this place, protect the source. Elias looked up immediately. What source? Clara turned several pages farther. Folded inside the journal was an old map of black hollow ridge marked with hand-drawn tunnels spreading beneath the mountain like veins beneath skin. At the center of the map, directly below the geothermal chamber, someone had circled a single phrase in dark ink. Thermal spring reservoir. Elias studied the map carefully while old instincts returned to him piece by piece. The geothermal reactor was not creating heat. It was redirecting natural thermal energy flowing beneath the mountain through underground springs deep within the ridge. Enough heat to power the entire shelter system for decades. Maybe longer. Clara looked stunned. Do you realize what this means? Elias nodded slowly. This mountain has enough natural heat to keep people alive through any winter storm. Above them, wind groaned faintly through the rock as the blizzard continued somewhere far beyond the buried tunnels. Elias suddenly understood why the rescue team never abandoned the shelter. This place was never meant to disappear. It had been built to save lives. Rusty barked softly toward the far wall where another narrow tunnel branched deeper into darkness. A faint orange glow flickered there now beneath the steady blue emergency lights. Elias picked up one final notebook resting near the edge of the desk. Unlike the others, this one carried a familiar name scratched into the cover. Caleb Grayson. His throat tightened instantly. He opened the journal carefully. The first pages described engineering repairs and storm reports, but near the final entries the writing shifted into something more personal. Elias read silently while the shelter hummed around them. We lost radio contact days ago. Avalanche sealed the upper exits. Most of the team wanted to abandon the reactor, but shutting it down would freeze half the ridge during winter storms. We stayed because someone had to keep the mountain alive. Elias stopped breathing for a moment. He turned another page. If you are reading this, then maybe Rusty finally found you. The puppy lifted his head immediately at the sound of his name. Elias stared at the page in disbelief. Caleb's handwriting continued beneath fading ink stains. The original Rusty died years ago, but his bloodline stayed here inside the thermal tunnels. Smart dogs. Loyal. They always knew the way back to the shelter. Elias slowly looked toward the small German shepherd sitting quietly beside the cot. Suddenly everything made terrible impossible sense. Rusty had not randomly appeared in the storm. The puppy belonged to this mountain. To this shelter. To Caleb. Clara wiped quietly at her eyes while reading over Elias's shoulder. The final journal entry was shorter than the others. If another storm ever comes strong enough to bury the ridge again, open the shelter. Let the mountain protect people the way it protected us. Elias closed the notebook slowly. The geothermal pulse rolled beneath the floor once more, warm and steady like the heartbeat of something ancient and patient beneath the earth. Then somewhere above them, faint but unmistakable, emergency sirens echoed through the tunnels from the world outside. The storm had reached the town. The emergency sirens echoed faintly through the underground tunnels like distant cries carried beneath the earth. Elias lifted his head slowly while the warm pulse of the geothermal reactor rolled through the shelter once more. Above them, Black Hollow Ridge was disappearing beneath another blizzard strong enough to bury roads, cabins, and entire sections of the mountain. But beneath the snow, the old shelter still breathed. Rusty stood immediately beside the tunnel entrance, ears raised toward the sounds coming from the surface world. Clara grabbed the radio from the desk and adjusted the frequency through bursts of static. Voices finally broke through the interference. Panicked. Overlapping. Highway 12 is closed. We lost power near the eastern ridge. People are trapped at the visitor center. Elias closed Caleb's journal carefully and slipped it into his coat beside the old compass. For the first time in years, the weight inside his chest no longer felt empty. It felt purposeful. He looked toward Clara. How many people can the shelter hold? Clara glanced toward the tunnel map spread across the desk. At least 50. Maybe more if the lower generators stay stable. Another pulse vibrated softly through the floor beneath them. Rusty barked once toward the staircase leading back upward. Waiting. Ready. Elias almost smiled. Then we opened the mountain. The storm above greeted them with roaring wind and endless snow when they finally emerged from the hidden staircase hours later. Night had fallen completely across Black Hollow Ridge. Visibility stretched barely 20 feet beyond the trees, and the blizzard had transformed the world into a swirling ocean of white and shadow. Clara contacted emergency crews through her Forest Service radio while Elias cleared the shelter entrance using old maintenance levers hidden beneath the snow. One by one, buried floodlights flickered alive along the ridge as power surged upward from the geothermal reactor below. Warm air began flowing through the emergency vents scattered across the mountainside, melting snow around the hidden entrances for the first time in decades. Rusty moved tirelessly beside Elias through the storm, guiding rescuers toward the safest paths between the drifts. Somehow the puppy always seemed to know where the snow was weakest before anyone else noticed. By midnight, the first stranded families reached the underground shelter. Elderly couples wrapped in frozen blankets. A mother carrying 2 exhausted children. Lost hikers. Rangers trapped by collapsed roads. They descended into the warmth beneath Black Hollow Ridge with disbelief shining across their tired faces as steam drifted gently through the glowing tunnels below. The shelter came alive again slowly. Coffee brewed on old emergency stoves. Blankets unfolded across the bunk rooms. Children slept safely beside humming heaters while weary strangers sat together listening to the storm rage harmlessly beyond the mountain walls. Elias stood near the observation window overlooking the glowing reactor cavern while snow battered the ridge far above them. Clara stepped quietly beside him. "Your brother saved this place," she said softly. Elias watched the blue light pulse beneath the mountain for several long seconds before answering. No, his hand rested gently against Rusty's head as the puppy leaned against his leg. He kept it alive long enough for someone else to find it. The mountain hummed softly around them, warm and steady now like an ancient heart buried beneath ice and stone. Elias reached into his coat and held Caleb's compass beneath the pale blue glow. For years he had wandered through life carrying grief like a storm that never ended. But standing there beside the people sleeping safely inside the shelter, he finally understood something his brother had known all along. Some places are not meant to be abandoned. Some lights are meant to stay on for the lost. Rusty lifted his head suddenly and looked toward the tunnel leading outside. Somewhere beyond the storm, dawn was beginning to touch the horizon above Black Hollow Ridge. The puppy's tail moved softly once against the floor. Elias looked down at him and smiled fully for the first time in many years. Then deep beneath the mountain, the geothermal pulse echoed once more through the shelter walls, warm and alive, like the mountain itself remembering kindness after all.